All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're so pleased that you're joining us for this very special Sundays at Home program. Today's program is a virtual guest curator-led tour of our newest online exhibit, Feminism, the Fourth Wave. And this is the last and final exhibit in our series of 4 that have debuted over the course of the past year. As I mentioned, my name is Jen Herrera, and I serve as the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who are returning, welcome back. We are so glad you can join us today for this special event. I'm joined today by NWHM Predoctoral Fellow in Women's History, Emma Rothberg. Emma is serving as our guest curator and guide for today's virtual tour. Emma is a PhD candidate in the History Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on gender, urban labor, and cultural history in the United States. She is very interested in the role of digital humanities in museums in expanding public awareness and knowledge of history. Originally from New York City, Emma has been fortunate to work at various museums and cultural institutions. She is currently in her second year of a 2-year tenure as the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Predoctoral Fellow in Gender Studies here at the museum, where she works to create digital and educational content to further support the museum's mission. We're so proud of the programming and scholarship that she contributes to the organization. Thank you for joining us today, Emma. I'm excited to have you do this wonderful virtual tour today. But before I hand this over to Emma, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. As always, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our website in the coming days. Emma will answer your questions after her presentation, so please use the chat feature for any comments that you have during the tour, but use the Q&A feature to actually ask a question. And at the end of the presentation, we will take questions. We want to hear your thoughts. So please use chat and the Q&A feature. Here's a little bit about the exhibit you're about to hear. While there is no agreed upon end to the third wave, scholars now debate whether a fourth wave of feminism began in the early 2010s. Women continued to make great strides in all areas of achievement through the 1990s and 2000s, but technological advancements enabled digital methods for organizing in recent years that some argue signify a new era of feminist activity. Feminists today continue to work on many of the same issues as their predecessors: equal pay, reproductive rights, sexual assault, but with the innovative tools of the digital age at their disposal. Please join me in welcoming Emma Rothberg to the screen. Emma?
Thank you, Jen, so much for that wonderful introduction and the introduction to the exhibit. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to walk you through this exhibit. Welcome to the virtual tour of Feminism, the Fourth Wave, the last of a 4-part exhibit series on the waves of feminism. If you haven't already, I encourage you to view the exhibits on the first, second, and third waves, which are posted on our website, and also the previous curator walkthroughs for each exhibit and the corresponding symposia events the museum has held for each exhibit called the Missing Waves of Feminism. So let me share my screen. All right. So you are actually going to be some of the first people to see the new exhibit as it hasn't been posted on our website or the Google Arts and Culture platform, which is why it says GAC admin copy on here, and I apologize for that. The exhibit only got finalized yesterday, so this is brand spanking new and it's very exciting. So I'm going to take you through this exhibit, adding further context and detail about the fourth wave. I'll also show a few images that are not included in the exhibit, but I still won't be able to get to everything. We'll cover some of the big hits of the fourth wave, but there's a lot more to the story. So before we dive into the exhibit, I want to touch base on a few important themes that are going to be really integral to understanding this fourth wave exhibit and our other exhibits on the waves of feminism. So the first is the debate over the waves metaphor itself. So the metaphor is coined in 1968 by Martha Wyman Lear in an article in the New York Times. And in the article, she connected what was happening in the 1960s, which is generally considered the second wave, to the suffrage movement of the 19th century, which is the first wave. The terminology quickly spread and became a popular way to define feminism. The waves metaphor is useful to help describe particularly active periods of feminist organizing at distinct periods in history, but many experts feel that at the same time, the metaphor really limits how we understand feminist history. So many experts, including historians and activists, are now pushing back on the waves metaphor because they argue it flattens and erases a lot of the experiences of non-white middle-class straight women. In particular, the waves metaphor erases the work done by women between the waves and the work women did to respond to forms of oppression or second-class citizenship other than sexism and misogyny. So we're talking about things like workers' rights or civil rights, that are not necessarily kind of female issues. So the other issue that people raise with the wave metaphor is that it implies a unitary or a homogenous experience for women within the wave, and that all women are building towards this one moment, right? A wave kind of builds and then crashes. This is implying there's a monolithic feminism, which is just really not true. Feminism has many goals, some of them are competing, and there's different ways of defining oneself as a feminist. So this is an important conversation regarding the usefulness of the waves metaphor, and it's something that the museum has made a central part of this series on the history of feminism. And the symposia that have accompanied each exhibit are entitled The Missing Waves of Feminism for this very reason. So it's really necessary to keep this conversation going as we extend our coverage into the fourth wave. The wave metaphor lends itself to the premise that each wave exceeds its predecessor and that each wave is superior to the previous, but the reality is much more nuanced and complicated than that. So what is the fourth wave? What are we here to talk about today? So as we discussed, the idea of waves can be problematic because they imply there is a definite start and end date. In reality, the feminist activism we are talking about is always happening in some capacity, and the complexity of the movement makes pinpointing a specific start or end date particularly difficult, and in particular, it makes it difficult for the fourth wave. So the third wave of feminism never had an official end date, but many activists recognize that the activism of the 21st century is somehow different than what was happening previously. So what happened in the third wave? Since the third and the fourth waves are so interconnected, I think it's important to give a brief overview of what we mean when we talk about the third wave of feminism. So for those of you who did or did not see the wonderful previous curator walkthrough that was done by my colleague Mariana, I want to summarize some of her main points. And I will add that you can go see that. It's posted on our YouTube page. And I highly encourage you to go watch Mariana's work. It's really, really great. Sorry. So some of Mariana's main points are that the activists who identified as third wavers challenged the understandings of feminism as a monolithic sisterhood, and one that was largely defined by white middle-class women, which predominated during the second wave. Instead, they favored multiplicity and diversity. Many third wave activists were born during the second wave years in the 1960s and 70s, so they didn't face the same legal barriers to education, work, and sports that their mothers did. So consequently, there are three core principles of the third wave, and they include a polyvocal feminism that acknowledges multiple perspectives, intersectional feminism that recognizes that gender justice is inextricably tied to other social justice movements, and a non-dogmatic feminism that allows for the complexities and contradictions of lived experiences. So the third wave, how historians generally define it, is that it's happening in the context of the Reagan and the George H.W. Bush years. So this is a context of backlash to what happened to the second wave. Feminists are still active during this time, but you also have the rise of the conservative right in the 80s and a loss of momentum in the women's movement, most markedly through the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1982. So it meant that the women's movement had faded in cultural prominence. Beginning in the mid-1980s, there was a growing conservative agenda that campaigned against things like political correctness, women's studies, and ethnic studies and affirmative action. The main targets were academia, federal funding for the arts, and those sorts of realms, but these culture wars reverberated throughout American society. So some of the major events that occurred during the third wave are the Anita Hill hearings, Rebecca Walker's coining of the term third wave, and the feminist cultural productions of punk rock, riot girl groups, and the Guerrilla Girls. And again, if you want to learn more about any of this, I encourage you to go look at our exhibit, watch the symposium on the missing waves that relates to the third wave, and also watch Mariana's walkthrough. So now that we've gone over a bit about what we mean by the third wave, I want to set the stage for the political and social context of the fourth wave. So the exhibit that we're going through today covers events and developments beginning in the late 1990s and into the current moment. Tongue twister there. So the fourth wave is still happening. Many of the fourth wave activists were born during the 1980s and 90s and grew up during the third wave or the beginning of the fourth wave. They did not face the same legal or social barriers to education, work, sports, or political office. In many cases, they're growing up in an era where women are going to college and attaining political office in higher numbers than ever before. Like the third wave, activists advocate intersectional feminism that recognizes that gender justice is inextricably tied to other social justice movements. So the phrase of women's rights or human rights has become a very popular phrase of late. You see it on a lot of signs during a lot of marches and protest movements. So despite the social and political gains, fourth wave activists continue to fight for rights and access. Some of the major battles have been against gender-based violence and advocacy for reproductive rights. The fourth wave is also a period in which digital spaces become central tools for organizing and activism. The rise of the internet and social media in particular, such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and more recently TikTok, have helped women and activists connect across wide geographical areas in ways that were not as easy or accessible before. So recently, a group of scholars sat down and talked about the fourth wave as part of the National Women's History Museum Symposium series. And while it hasn't been posted on our website yet, but stay tuned, it should be there soon, these scholars talked about the importance of social media for activists. Social media, along with some high-profile organizations, brought renewed attention to widespread examples of discrimination against women. Social media has also been used to promote more traditional forms of organizing, such as the worldwide women's marches that began as a reaction to the 2016 presidential election. Feminists today continue to work on many of the same issues as their predecessors, such as equal pay, reproductive rights, and sexual assault, but with the innovative tools of the digital age at their disposal. So now kind of connecting the third and the fourth waves in terms of the context and the types of issues that women are fighting for, one of the questions I want us to keep in mind as we move through this exhibit is, are we still in the third wave or not? Is the fourth wave something different than the third wave? Or is it really just a continuation with new methods? So this is not a settled question, and it's definitely open to further debate. So let's wade in. So reproductive rights have been a constant concern of activists during all of the waves of feminism. In particular, the right to have and access to an abortion continues to be a main issue around which activists organize. Despite Roe v. Wade in 1973, it is not a settled issue, which we know from what's been happening at the Supreme Court recently. So many women in the movement believe they should have reproductive freedom and the option to have an abortion without additional hurdles if they choose. However, many states put in controversial legislation that often prevents women from achieving full autonomy when it comes to their reproductive health. The latest example is SB 8 in Texas, which went into effect in September 2021 and is currently being challenged in the courts. The Supreme Court is set to hear the case on the Texas law soon, and they just heard arguments in the case Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization about a law restricting abortion in Mississippi this past Wednesday. So what this picture here is on the exhibit is the National Organization for Women, also known as NOW, has organized several marches to fight against restrictive legislation and advocate for women's reproductive rights, including 3 separate March for Women's Lives in 1989, 1992, and 2004. Marches for abortion access and reproductive rights continue to be organized. So in October 2021, the Women's March organized marches across the country to protest Texas's SB 8, and they organized another this past Wednesday, December 1st, in Washington, D.C. to coincide with the Supreme Court hearings in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. So I want to kind of draw a point of connection here. Marching has always been an important tactic for the feminist movement. During the first wave, activists marched for the vote and against lynching. During the second wave, feminists marched on Washington in 1963 for civil rights. They marched against the Miss America pageant in 1968. And they marched during the Women's Strike for Peace and Equality in New York City on August 26, 1970, just to name a few. So why marching? I would argue this very public nature is what is so appealing. You're being seen, you're disrupting and challenging gender norms that expect women to be in the home or quiet or unaggressive, et cetera. Even though expectations about proper womanhood may have changed over the decades, marching remains a powerful tactic and disrupts assumptions about what women can and should do. So in addition to the marches, women continue to make great strides in politics, and several have made and continue to make history by assuming political leadership in various states and national offices. In 1997, Madeleine Albright became the first woman to serve as US Secretary of State, serving until 2001 until President Clinton. Under President Clinton. In 2007, Nancy Pelosi became the first and still only woman to serve as Speaker of the House, and she is still in that role currently. And then in 2021, we reached a few more milestones. Kamala Harris became the first woman, as well as the first African-American, first Indian-American, and first person of Asian-American descent sworn in as Vice President of the United States. She is the highest ranking woman and the second in line in the presidential line of succession, which we have to update on this slide because it was written before Vice President Harris was sworn in. And Harris reached another milestone on November 19th, 2021, when she became the first woman in US history to be invested with presidential powers. As President Biden underwent anesthesia for a routine medical procedure, Harris stepped into the role as acting president for 85 minutes. So we lived through history, we may have not even known it. So Janet Yellen also became the first woman to serve as US Secretary of the Treasury and was appointed by President Biden to serve in that role in 2021. We have biographies on our website on Vice President Harris and a bio in our magazine Clio on Janet Yellen, which will hopefully be published online soon. And I encourage you to check them out for more information on these amazing path-breaking women. So one of the things that defines the fourth wave is the way activists have been able to harness the power of the internet, in particular that of social media, in order to build on their successful grassroots activism of the past. Beginning in the early 2000s, social networking applications began their golden age of invention, and many of the platforms we know as household names were founded, such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. In many ways, these online platforms work in the same way as pen and paper organizing worked in decades and centuries prior, just on a much larger scale. While first wave feminists distributed pamphlets, fourth wave feminists created hashtags, shared images, and organized events online. These platforms created a space for activists to connect, share ideas, strategies, and stories, a place to plan and a place to talk. Several advocacy groups developed campaigns using hashtags to raise awareness and gain community support. These short phrases quickly became trending topics on social media, websites, and strategically spread the word around various issues. Popular hashtags like hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, hashtag Black Lives Matter, and hashtag Yes All Women brought attention to pressing issues of social justice and reform. Even hashtags such as the hashtag Ice Bucket Challenge gained the attention of millions to raise awareness and money for research for ALS. So this is a video of Nikki Haley, who was challenged, had an Ice Bucket Challenge. So I'll let that play in the background. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the backlash social media platforms have received recently. While social media has proved a great and essential tool for activists, it has also allowed for hate speech and divisiveness to thrive and spread. It is not just feminist activists who use the internet to organize. A lot of amazing scholarship has come out recently on how white power activists have largely relocated to the internet. And one person who's written and spoken a lot about the white power activists is University of Chicago professor Kathleen Belew. And I encourage you to check out her writing. She's written in the New York Times, Washington Post, a number of other online publications. And she also recently published her book, Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America. So there's an ongoing discussion about the place of social media, if it's good or bad, and if it does more to unite or divide us. And feminist groups have also found themselves at this crossroads when it comes to social media. Many companies also use social media to associate themselves with causes, including women's causes. Some of these campaigns have received backlash as being insincere or solely for the purpose of good PR. At the same time, they bring awareness to the issue and create conversations. There is a legitimate debate to be had around social media and its uses. So one popular and important hashtag that emerged was hashtag #MeToo, a women's advocacy campaign founded by Tarana Burke in 2007. So in 1996, Tarana Burke had an encounter with a young woman that she would never forget. While Burke was working as the director of a youth camp, a young lady privately disclosed that she was a victim of sexual abuse. Also a survivor of sexual abuse, Burke identified with her immediately, and all she wanted to say was, "Me too." So who is Tarana Burke? She was born in 1973 in the Bronx and developed an early passion for activism and community organizing from an early age. In the 1980s, she joined an organization focused on youth development called the 21st Century. As a member of this organization, she led campaigns and launched initiatives around issues like housing inequality, racial discrimination, and economic injustice. She went to Alabama State University, which is an HBCU, and after graduation moved to Selma to work for 21st Century. So although Burke was unable to respond how she wanted to in the moment to the young woman at this camp, this encounter with the young woman would become the foundation for the Me Too campaign she created a decade later. By 2007, Burke had launched Me Too as a way for young women of color to share their stories. To start, she began using the phrase Me Too specifically to promote the idea of, quote, empowerment through empathy. Her campaign was not only designed to facilitate healing, but she also wanted to train survivors to work in communities of color. So as Burke developed Me Too, she continued to work in the nonprofit sector. We have a bio of Tarana Burke on our website, and I encourage you to look at that for more information. So in 2017, Burke's hashtag #MeToo went viral on social media due to the sex scandal surrounding Harvey Weinstein, the Hollywood producer. Over 90 women came forward against Weinstein and exposed how he used his power to sexually harass and exploit women in the entertainment industry for over 30 years. In February 2020, Weinstein was convicted of sexual assault and rape in New York and sentenced to 23 years in prison. He's still awaiting trial in Los Angeles on charges of attacking 5 women from 2004 to 2013. Shortly after the scandal broke, actress Alyssa Milano helped popularize the hashtag by encouraging all women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted to tweet #MeToo, arguing, quote, it might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. In less than 24 hours, 4.7 million people engaged in the conversation with more than 12 million posts, comments, or reactions on Facebook. As of 2020, the hashtag has been used more than 19 million times. Another sex scandal which broke during the hashtag #MeToo movement was that of Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby was convicted in 2018 on 3 counts of felony indecent aggravated assault. However, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overruled the conviction in June 2021, and Cosby was released. On Monday, just this past Monday, November 29th, prosecutors in Pennsylvania asked the Supreme Court to review the court's decision to release Cosby. So this is ongoing, right? The Me Too movement is still happening. So in 2017, Time magazine named Tarana Burke, Alyssa Milano, and many other silence breakers as their Time Person of the Year. People all over the world have since started using the Me Too hashtag to share their stories, and the hashtag has been translated into various languages. There is a global reckoning over sexual harassment, assault, and gender violence. A month after the Weinstein scandal broke, a group of 700,000 Latina farm workers from across the country wrote an open letter of support to the silence breakers in Hollywood. These women shared similar experiences and signed their message with, quote, "We believe and stand with you." These women were all members of the Coalition of Women Farm Workers called Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. I apologize if I did not pronounce that correctly, and that translates to the National Farm Worker Women's Alliance. So 2 days after the letter's release on November 12, 2017, hundreds of women in downtown Los Angeles marched to protest sexual harassment. The Me Too Survivors March sought to create a safe space for survivors and allies to rally against sexual misconduct. On the same day in downtown LA, the Take Back the Workplace March also met downtown to take a stand against workplace harassment. The 2 parades met and joined forces. So hashtag Me Too has been an important conversation starter, I want to stress that, and made more women comfortable coming forward to share their stories. But it has also received some criticism for being too widely applied or for how it equates all kinds of different experiences. But again, hashtag Me Too has brought a lot of attention to the continued issue of sexual harassment, and there is still work to be done. So while the hashtag #MeToo movement was heating up, another campaign prepared to launch in Hollywood to contribute to the widespread surge of women's activism. In response to the letter of support from 700,000 women farm workers, Time's Up publicly launched on January 1st, 2018, with their own open letter signed by over 300 women in the entertainment industry. Published in the New York Times, this letter thanked the farm workers and announced that they would be using their network and platforms to advocate for survivors of harassment and injustice. Their motto was Time's Up. So Time's Up also launched several initiatives to ensure gender parity and workplace safety in various industries. The Time's Up Legal Defense Fund was established to help survivors, especially women of color and low-income women, get connected to lawyers and resources. This network has over 800 lawyers working to fight for women's causes. In addition, Time's Up Now was established to prevent future acts of harassment and discrimination. In an effort to raise awareness, many attendees, some of whom are pictured here on the screen, to the 75th Golden Globes were all Black with either hashtag #MeToo or Time's Up pins to support the movement. A few activists also came as guests of the attendees, and then attendees at other award shows followed suit by wearing all Black or wearing the pins. Since its launch, Time's Up has received criticism. A group based in and led by many Hollywood industry leaders, some don't see it as an inclusive or accessible to many women. Leadership has also come under fire for the ways in which some of them were involved with the scandal surrounding former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's alleged sexual harassment. In September 2021, Time's Up dissolved its advisory board and the entire governing board resigned and will be replaced. The group has since been described as being in, quote, free fall, because critics argue the cognitive dissonance between what the group purports to do and then what its leadership has done. So the fallout around Time's Up is also not new to the waves of feminism. Leaders of feminist movements have previously been accused of not walking the walk, so to speak. While leadership, such as during the push for the vote during the first wave or for more access during the second wave, has spoken of fighting for all women, their actions sometimes only work for certain groups of women. So it's contradictory, and we live with these contradictions. On January 21st, 2017, the day after Inauguration Day, the Women's March on Washington attracted an estimated 1.5 million protesters in response to the 2016 election. This march became the largest single-day protest in US history, with women's marches happening simultaneously across the country. In total, there were between 3.3 and 4.6 million protesters advocating for women's rights and various social justice issues, including racial equity, immigration reform, reproductive rights, the environment, and LGBTQ+ rights. Second wave feminists Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem both gave speeches at the march. So women's marches also happened globally on January 21st. Organizers reported there were 673 marches that took place worldwide. Marches happened on all 7 continents. There were 29 marches in Canada, 20 in Mexico, and 1 even in Antarctica. Small and large countries had women's marches. In India, women organized the I Will Go Out March on January 21st, 2017 to demand access to safe public spaces. Many countries on the continent of Africa, including Kenya, Nigeria, and Tanzania, also held marches calling for women to have equal rights and demanding an end to violence against women. So this should be a video of some of the footage of the Women's March on Washington, which I will stop play.
To be honest, I think they're most of them. You see them with their respective heads.
So in January 2018, feminist activists drew from the momentum of the Me Too and Time's Up movements to celebrate the anniversary of the 2017 Women's March. Although the attendance was lower than in previous years, over 250 marches and rallies were held across the country to commemorate the first march and advocate for more change. So I want to pause here and think about the connections between what is happening in the fourth wave and what has happened previously. So since 2017, the Women's March, the organization, has struggled and faced controversy. Some of its leaders who have since stepped down were accused of anti-Semitism and racism. The movement itself has been critiqued as being a space primarily for white cisgender women. These same critiques had fallen on Time's Up and #MeToo. So remember, the latter was started as a way for women of color to share their stories, but now it's been taken out of that context and made more universal. So the questions that we ask ourselves is that in keeping with its intent or not, the #MeToo, and does that matter if the hashtag applies to other groups? So these critiques that major feminist organizations are mainly spaces for white, middle-class, straight women are not new. They have appeared over and over again in every wave of feminism. So during the first wave, feminists split over their support or not of the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote. Some women argued they needed to stand in solidarity because of their abolitionist roots and because the expansion of the vote to anyone was progress. Others argued educated white women should get the vote first, that they were somehow more deserving. They relied on racial language and stereotypes in making this argument, and it was a form of white supremacy. The same split happened with the 19th Amendment, where many suffragists began arguing it was more important to keep the South by focusing on white women in the vote. Many women of color were barred from joining the national organizations or had to join in segregated locals. In the end, the 19th Amendment only removed sex as a barrier to voting, meaning many women of color, working class women, immigrant women, or non-citizens could still not vote. Yet many suffragists declared that they had won the battle. During the second wave, the National Organization for Women, NOW, was also criticized for being a space mainly for the concerns and activism of white cisgender women. For example, The Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan, focused on the issues of white women who did not need to leave the house for work. That focus excluded millions of women who did not work outside the household. NOW was also accused of ignoring and excluding lesbians and lesbian issues. In 1970, a group of lesbians staged a, quote, lavender menace protest at a feminist conference and pressed NOW and the women's movement in general to change its stance on lesbianism and include them in the feminist movement. And then we also have to remember that while millions of women, like the ones pictured here, marched in the Women's March in January 2017, millions of women voted for Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020, and millions of women do not support abortion access. So all of that is to say that it's important to remember that feminism and feminists have never been monolithic. They weren't during the first wave, second or third waves, and they still aren't now. The questions feminists and activists asked themselves over a century ago are still being asked and attempted to be answered today. So in summer 2018, Professor Christine Blasey Ford, who's pictured here, appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee on September 27, 2018 to testify against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Ford testified that Kavanaugh had attempted to rape her at a house party when they were in high school. Two other women, Deborah Ramirez and Julie Swetnick, also accused Kavanaugh of sexual assault in the past. Ford's testimony reminded many of Anita Hill's testimony during the confirmation hearings for now Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. On October 11, 1991, the world watched as attorney Anita Hill testified against Thomas for sexual harassment, or accusing him of sexual harassment. In the televised hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Hill claimed that Thomas had repeatedly harassed her while she was his employee at the Department of Education and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Despite Hill's testimony, Thomas was still confirmed as a Supreme Court justice after the 3-day hearings. Like Thomas, despite Ford's testimony, Kavanaugh was confirmed and now serves as a Supreme Court justice. So again, these issues are recurring over the course of the waves, in particular between the third and the fourth. So a day after the court proceedings, women rallied around another feminist campaign slogan. The popular dating app Bumble, known for its women-centric approach to matching potential partners, decided to take out a full-page ad in the New York Times with just 2 words printed, "Believe women." And this is still a phrase and a slogan that gets used. So amidst the controversies, women continue to reach higher levels of political leadership. In 2016, Hillary Clinton became the first woman to lead a major party's national ticket when she won the Democratic presidential nomination. In 2016, also, a record number of women were elected in Congress. That included 21 senators, 104 House members, and the first Latina to serve in the upper chamber. In 2020, the number of women in Congress grew again. So although they make up just over a quarter of all members in the 177th Congress, according to Pew Research, they make up about 27% of all seats in the House and Senate. So 144 out of 539 seats are held by women. So this wave of elected women reminded many of the, quote, year of the woman, which happened in 1992, a year after the Hill hearings. In 1992, more women than ever were elected to Congress, 27. That was 1992 numbers, and now we're at 144. So 2020 became another year of the women. It's certainly progress, but it's still not representative, given that while women make up 27% of Congress, women make up about 51% of the US population. So a popular phrase that emerged over the past few years, which I've mentioned before, is women's rights or human rights. The yellow sign held by the central woman in this picture, I think, gets at the heart of this phrase. Feminist activists are fighting for a myriad of intersecting goals and see the fight for social justice to be just as important for women's rights. So, for example, in the current debate over the Build Back Better bill or the social infrastructure bill, there is disagreement about whether certain healthcare issues will stay in the bill. Items such as paid family leave, expansion of Medicare or Medicaid, additional monetary support for children and families, more funding for childcare or universal pre-K coverage are not explicitly women's rights issues, but many women feel strongly that these types of supports are needed for them to have full time and access to be treated equally in society. So another fight is for the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first proposed during the first wave in 1923. It was passed by Congress during the second wave in 1972. Missed the ratification deadline during the third wave in 1982, and then reached a ratification threshold when Virginia voted to ratify it during the fourth wave on January 15th, 2021. So the movement for ratification and why Virginia ratified it after so many years, many people point to the #MeToo Women's March and the fact that more women were elected to Congress as things that kind of propelled the conversation around the ERA back into the conversation. So that being said, not all activists agree the ERA is the answer. They debate the differences between equality and equity, and if the ERA will actually achieve the goals its proponents want. Right, so as various forms of activism emerge, fourth wave feminists continue to provide innovative ways to advocate for women's rights. Although many of the same issues have plagued each wave of feminism across generations, fourth wave feminists are incorporating new methods of activism to address issues such as reproductive rights, equal pay, and sexual assault, just to name a few. With every small step, these feminists continue to fight until full equality and participation is achieved for women everywhere. And I encourage you to come back and watch these videos. So I want to return to the question I posed at the beginning of this walkthrough. Are we in a fourth wave? Or are we still in the third wave? If we are in a fourth wave, how do we know when it ends? Many of the issues that feminists in the past fought for, which include equality, access, reproductive rights, and freedom from sexual harassment and assault, are still central to feminists today. They are also still being defined. What do we mean by equality, and how do we know if we've achieved it? If you open a newspaper, you will still see headline after headline related to issues of women's rights, reproductive rights, and access, and gender-based violence. It's unfortunate, but it shows that the activism around these issues is still necessary and it's still contested. So women activists, we all are still fighting for these causes, and there is still work to be done. So thank you so much for being here and listening to me, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was such a great presentation. We really appreciate it. As I said in the chat, if you have a question for Emma, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen. Emma, before we get into a discussion about the exhibit and the fourth wave, can you talk a little bit about your fellowship with the museum and how you came to join us.
Sure, I would love to. So as Jen, as you mentioned in my short bio, I've been very fortunate to have worked at a number of cultural institutions over the years, including as I've been in grad school. And I knew I wanted to get back into that world. This is the profession that I want to, pursue. So I happened to be looking around and I stumbled across the National Women's History Museum's website, and I saw that they had a fellowship, and I thought, this is exactly what I want to do. It's museum work, it's women's history, which is something I'm very passionate about. It's a new and emerging museum. There's lots of opportunities here to do really interesting and compelling digital work, which is something that I'm also very interested in and passionate about. So I applied, and luckily I was accepted, and I've had a wonderful going on 2 years at the museum. And some of the projects that I've worked on are writing the monthly Fab Five, which I split with my colleague Mariana. We write other bios that go in Clio, which is our magazine, as well as on the website. We've created 2 exhibits, like the Fourth Wave exhibit, one on Maria Tallchief, who was America's first prima ballerina, and also a member of the Osage tribe, and then on artist Alma Thomas, who was an African-American mid-20th century painter. I've also created a map, which is a walking tour of the push for the 19th Amendment in BC, and that was in collaboration with a local tour group, A Tour of Her Own. It's a really cool resource. I would check it out. And beyond those digital tools, I answer emails for people who come in with research requests, students who are doing research for National History Day or class projects. And just kind of generally am there as a research resource for those who have historically related questions. So it's been a really, really wonderful 1.5 years. And I'm looking forward to my next roughly 6 months on fellowship.
Can you talk a little bit about your role as a curator with the museum and how you curate and the process?
Sure. Yeah, so I didn't curate this exhibit, the Fourth Wave exhibit. This was done by the previous fellow, Carrie Lee Alexander. And she did all of the the Ways of Feminism exhibits, which have been really fun to see what she did. When I've worked on the 2 exhibits that I've worked on, which I did with Mariana, one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was telling both an individual story in a global context, right? How can we use the person who we are focusing on to get at larger themes, issues, context, right? We don't just want it to be a biography, because we have those biographies and they're wonderful, but, we want to expand it out. So, a lot of it is thinking about the time period in which the person lived, and what we know about what major events happened, seeing the ways in which the person either was directly or indirectly involved, how we can talk about that larger context and how it had an effect on that person's life. So those are kind of the major questions that we think about. And then more on the nitty-gritty level, we think, okay, how can we make this story compelling, right? How can we make people want to read about this person, learn about this person? A lot of that we try to achieve through using anecdotal information, fun quotes, or, things you're not going to read about necessarily in a kind of 700-word bio. We try to find dynamic images or video. And then we try to make sure that it's not overwhelming. So that's kind of when I come in as a curator, I'm trying to put together all this information. It's how can we make it dynamic, accessible, interesting, and both personal and more global, so that you can get something out of it if you are just interested in the person, and you can also get something out of it if you're interested in the context in which they lived.
Great. Now, specifically about this exhibit, this is the 4th, as we discussed at the very beginning, the 4th of 4 exhibits that we did on the waves. What was something that that surprised you in researching and preparing for today, and kind of all of your contributions to our feminism series and symposium?
Sure, that's a good question. I think one of the things that struck me, because I hadn't really thought about it, and it's why I posed the question at the beginning, was, are we really in a fourth wave? Is this really just a continuation of the third wave, because we're tackling, unfortunately, so many of the same issues that third wave activists were focused on 20, 30 years ago. And I think that there really is an open question, and I don't necessarily have an answer to it, if there's something different about the fourth wave, or if what we're seeing now is different because of the resources that we have, but the questions remain the same. So that was something that I found interesting when I was putting together the information and trying to draw connections across the waves. Admittedly, I am a 19th and early 20th century scholar. So that's the area that I know more about. So I also found it really interesting to see the ways in which the tactics and the criticisms between what was happening in the first wave, which is more, in my scholarly wheelhouse, and what's happening now, how much overlap there is.
Can you talk a little bit about that overlap?
Sure. So I kind of briefly mentioned a couple of points of connection that I saw, but I think one of the main points of connection is also a kind of a question, which is, what is the most pressing issue? And the fact that not all feminists agree on what the most pressing issue is, either, now, right? Again, you open a newspaper and you see the various ways in which women are trying to get at this question of what is equality and what is equity. And, the same types of questions are being asked during the first wave, right? Is it the vote? Is that the most important thing? If once women have the vote, everything else kind of falls in place. Or is it about getting civil, anti-lynching legislation passed? Or is it about, getting workplace safety, right? I mean, obviously the vote is incredibly important, but that wasn't the primary thing that many women who are having to leave the house to go work on a factory floor are concerned with, right? They're concerned about, literally not losing their fingers. Right. So I think that kind of overarching question of what should we be fighting for, and the fact that there are disagreements in every single wave, right? Again, feminists are not a monolith, is something that I found really interesting. And, then there are more specifics, like how I drew out the fact that suffragists were parading in the streets in order to advocate for the vote. They're using their feet in order to, to protest the fact that they don't have the vote, and you still have hundreds of thousands of women, if not sometimes millions of women and their allies, taking to the streets today to march as a sign of protest.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'm not sure how much, well, it hasn't happened yet. We have our fourth wave symposium, which talk a little bit about the series.
Sure.
And what we discussed already and what's coming up.
Yeah, so the symposiums on the first, second, and third waves have already been posted. And again, I really encourage you to go see those. And the one on the fourth wave is either about to be recorded or has been recorded and just needs to be posted. But what those symposiums did was bring together groups of scholars who had expertise in the era, basically to talk about what wasn't in the exhibit, or how we can kind of complicate the ways in which we think, think more critically about feminism and the women's activism that is happening in these periods that we're defining as the waves, and also what's happening outside of those waves and what those waves miss, hence the title, Missing Waves of Feminism. So I watched the first one, again, because that's my area of expertise, and I was also doing the walkthrough for that exhibit. And a lot of the things that the scholars were focused on were the experiences of women of color, and in particular, the ways in which working class women and women of color, a lot of the activism that they're focused on happens post the 19th Amendment, right? We're talking about the 1920s and 30s, when you have these major movements against lynching and against and for workplace safety, and how we skip that, right? We forget that that happened, and we just kind of moved to the 60s and the formation of now. So I found that really interesting because it's something that I've discussed in some of my graduate coursework, is the ways in which women were so directly involved in the workers' rights movements during the 1930s. So that's just kind of one example of what the symposium we're talking about.
Yeah, it's actually going to be, the fourth one is coming up, so December 12th. So I guess that's a week from today.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Okay, so we do hope you'll join us for that. If you have a question, we're about to wrap up, but please feel free to put it in the chat. Barbara, you asked how to contact us. Please go ahead and send an email to history@womenshistory.org. Evelyn, has there been any exploration on women and religion during any of the waves?
Ooh, that's a very interesting question. So not explicitly in these exhibits, but I know that there is a lot of really interesting work out there concerning, how women were involved in religious movements and how that then connected to, larger activism. Mm-hmm. So again, not to harp on the first wave, but again, that's my area of scholarly expertise. A lot of the women who were involved in the suffrage movement came from the abolitionist movement and the temperance movement, which had religious inflections to it, right? This idea that to be a good Christian, you shouldn't be enslaving people, right? Like that slavery was wrong in the eyes of God. So a lot of women are taking their teachings from the church and also their experiences in the church, right? These are places in which women can have some leadership roles. They're places in which women can gather and talk, and they take both their teachings and the organizations that are happening in the church, and they start talking about other issues, and they go, wait a minute, we're all connected here. Let's talk about this, right? Let's push for X. So there is a lot of great scholarship out there. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'll think about it and can make sure that Jen gets a list so she can send it out. But yes, there has definitely been a lot of work about the ways in which women are both using their religious backgrounds or religious organizations or pushing back against religious organizations or their religious background as ways of informing their feminist activism.
A little on that note about resources, are there any recommendations you have for resources in general about any of the waves that you found particularly helpful, particularly fourth wave, but really any of the waves?
For sure. I mean, I would absolutely go to the National Women's History Museum's website, look at our exhibits, look at the works cited pages on the relevant biographies as well as the exhibits. We keep very detailed citations on there. So I highly encourage you to look at that. And in terms of the fourth wave, I mentioned this at kind of the end of the talk, but a lot of what I did was I honestly went to newspapers and I saw what the headlines were. And you see these headlines over and over and over again, and you start seeing what the kind of the major themes and the major issues are that are in the news, because those are the things that are in the conversation that women are fighting about. So that's not necessarily a scholarly source, but it is to say that we are living through this history, and we are, it is informing our lives, whether we're directly engaged with it or not. So yeah, open your newspaper. But yeah, again, I will think about some books and I can pass those names along.
Thank you so much. Well, we're about time and there's no more questions in our Q&A, but I want to thank you, Emma, so much for this wonderful presentation, and to everybody who has joined us today. We really appreciate you spending your Sunday afternoon exploring the fourth wave with us. As we discussed, our final symposium, Missing Waves of Feminism event will actually happen Sunday, December 12th. And you can sign up and interact live with our scholars and really dig into a discussion with us. So please join us. You can register for that. as well as all of our other upcoming events. If you go to our website, which is womenshistory.org, there's right on the homepage, you can see a list of upcoming events, and it'll take you to the registration sites. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Emma, and happy holidays, everyone. Take care.
Bye.